Hey folks, this is Carlos Velez from Lacerta Bio, where we're taking our annual look. This time we're looking back at 2020 and we're looking forward to 2021. So, what was interesting in 2020? I think there's one place to start, the obvious place to start, and that is by taking another look back at Adukanyumab. Now, if you remember from last year's presentation, we took a closer look at the development history of this monoclonal antibody for Alzheimer's, and we actually have an update. As it turns out, the FDA AdCom voted against approving, or they recommended not approving, aducanumab for Alzheimer's. We're expecting a final FDA decision sometime in the first quarter of next year. I won't go through the entire history of it. Suffice to say that it's quite interesting. But it's really unfortunate because if there's one therapeutic area where we need something, it's certainly in Alzheimer's. So this is unfortunate for Alzheimer's patients and their family members, but hopefully we'll see something in the future for this just horrible, horrible disease. Second thing that was interesting in 2020 was these two fellows. And if you don't recognize them, that molecule on the left is CBD and the one on the right is THC. Now, we've actually been somewhat surprised over the past year, both in terms of the amount of activity that's taking place, especially on the recreational cannabis and to a lesser degree on the medical cannabis side. But when you actually look at what's in development, there's really not that much. There's about 60 clinical programs ongoing globally, at least according to Biomed Tracker, of either individual compounds that are targeting one of the cannabinoid receptors, or there are a couple of cannabis extracts that are currently in clinical studies, primarily for pain. We do have a couple of products out there, primarily for the epilepsies. But we can't help but wonder if this is an area of pharmacology that's still relatively unexplored. And considering the unmet needs that we still have, especially for non-opioid pain relievers, it's great to see some of this activity, especially in the clinic, but we desperately need more. So we're hoping that we'll see much more activity in the cannabinoid space in the coming years. And the third thing from this year is, well, frankly, this whole COVID thing. Now, rather than repeating a lot of the stuff that's been talked about and, the things that we're seeing in the news every day, number of cases, blah, 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 what I decided to do was to pick three specific things about COVID and talk about them in a little bit of detail. And a few of these are, frankly, things that are quite concerning. The first one is mass PCR testing. Now, this is a problem. I don't know how else to say this, but I think mass testing using PCR is just a horrible idea. Anytime you talk about mass testing with overcooked PCR, as I call it, it's just a tremendous problem. The number of false positives that we're seeing and so forth, it's just amazing. And what's really amazing is that when you think about diagnostics in general, what are diagnostics for? They're primarily for a differential diagnosis and for the development of treatment plans. So when do we ever test a healthy population at scale, a healthy asymptomatic population at scale? When you think about it, it's quite rare. Yes, we do monitor for things like lipids and blood pressure and so forth, but those are for diseases that are initially asymptomatic. But when you're talking about a respiratory viral infection, it's clearly not asymptomatic. You're clearly symptomatic when you're ill. That's the time to perform a differential diagnosis, just like you perform with, let's say, a bacterial infection. So, this and other things raises issues about whether or not governments have handled COVID-19 well, whether it's in terms of lockdown policies, mask versus no mask, vaccine distribution now. And the answer in our view is no, which raises the broader issue about whether governments can make solid policy decisions without solid data. Clearly not. And basing policy decisions which impact all of us on this type of approach is frankly a horrible idea. And when history looks back at 2020, hopefully this will be one of the things that's discussed, and maybe at some point some fingers will be pointed and so forth, but we'll see. But I think this fundamentally has caused a tremendous deal of issues for all of us. And hopefully this will change in the coming year. But I think one thing that we did get right when it comes to COVID is in the area of industry and government partnerships. Now, this was a slide that I had in last year's review. And if you remember, towards the middle and tail end of 2019, our industry was getting hammered by government over drug pricing. And it looks like we finally got something right. We got a government industry relationship that actually works, even though the press are, as the headline says, loath to admit it. We did get something right. Now, the key thing with this relationship is government pre-ordering of vaccines. Because once you have that revenue in place, now that program that a company is developing is essentially de-risked. Now, we got lucky in that the science and the technology were already there. We were able, these companies like Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech were able to pivot very quickly and develop the vaccines that we need. Imagine if we were trying to do this from scratch. Imagine how much longer we would have to wait for vaccines. Now we would definitely be talking about potentially waiting for years until we got viable vaccines. So, between government and luck, it looks like we're going to get, mass vaccination relatively quickly. Now, this is a model that we think can be applied to other areas. Now, the two big ones in our mind are novel antibiotics and non-opioid pain relievers. Now, these are areas where there's a lot of unmet need. There's little to no industry activity in these two areas. There's some in the non-opioid pain reliever space, but quite frankly, we need a lot more. And antibiotics, I don't want to flog a dead horse here. Clearly, this is an area where the economics from an industry point of view simply don't work. So if there's an area where government and industry can partner, it's absolutely in the development of novel antibiotics and also the development of novel non-opioid pain relievers. And the third thing about COVID that I wanted to talk about a little bit is, when will normal return? This is an interesting question. It's something that many of us have been talking about. And I think to answer this question, we need to look at a couple of different things. And the first thing we need to look at is the seasonality of viral circulation. Now, for some reason, there are people especially in the press, who don't realize this, but endemic viruses are seasonal. And this is just one example of European northern temperate. You'll see a coronavirus there in that pinkish red. The lighter blue is influenza. Viruses come and go based on seasons. Now, this is nothing new. If you look at textbooks on influenza, for example, the graphs on the left were from studies done in Africa in the 1950s. And the one on the right is data for influenza from the 60s and 70s, long before there were any vaccines for flu. And yet here we are. If you look at northern temperate, you see it begins to rise July, August, September, peaks sometime in January and falls off. And indeed, this is what we're seeing now. So if you're sitting in New York right now, you'll see quote unquote cases of coronavirus rising, and they will probably peak sometime in the January, February timeframe, and then gradually fall off. If you're in the southern hemisphere, obviously, since your winter is at a different time on the calendar, you're gonna see a different pattern. If you are more along the equator, you're gonna see a slightly different pattern. We see this for influenza, we see this for other viruses, we see this for the other coronaviruses that circulate the planet. And there's no reason to think that SARS-CoV-2 will be any different. Now, what will be different is the slope of, let's say, this line or this decline in the first quarter of next year. Now, that slope will be driven primarily by the vaccines. So the faster we get the vaccines out, presumably this slope will become that much steeper, and we'll get down to near zero relatively quickly. Which gets us to the next point, which is the quote-unquote Frankenstein vaccines. Now, there's a lot of anti-vaccine sentiment out there. We don't know exactly to what degree that's going to impact vaccine distribution. I apologize, this is a little bit blurry. But Goldman Sachs and others have been trying to project the percent of various populations that will be vaccinated, because that has obvious economic impact or economic influences on their projections moving forward. And clearly what you see is, irrespective of what the slope might be, Goldman Sachs and others believe that the percent of population that will be vaccinated will be somewhere, let's call it 50, 60, 70% will be vaccinated. So not everybody will be vaccinated, which will obviously then impact that slope that we talked about earlier. So it'll be very interesting to see, what this initial on-ramp of vaccine compliance looks like. Now, if you want to track this on a day-to-day, from a day-to-day perspective, the CDC has started to gather vaccination data from the individual states. I believe the Europeans are also gathering similar data, although I'm not 100% sure where that's going to be housed. But the CDC is gathering data as well. It'll be interesting to see how rapidly these vaccines can be distributed and administered, especially once the Moderna one starts rolling out in the coming weeks. So when will we return to normal? I obviously couldn't tell you for sure, but I think, from an industry point of view, we're probably looking at some time during the second half of next year. Now, one of the milestones of the year is BIO, which typically takes place in June. They've already decided to go digital this year. So they're, in a sense, agreeing with our projection that the first half of next year will probably be roughly what we're doing now in terms of work from home and so forth and so on. Now, if you look at some of the fall conferences, at least as of today, and I'm recording this on December 24th, they're still assuming that there will be live events in September, October, and so forth. So we'll just have to see what those slopes look like in terms of the decrease in cases, decreased hospitalizations, increasing vaccinations, and so forth. And we'll see what happens. But what will normal actually look like? What's normal? Well, I think there are a couple of ways to look at this. One is, when are we all going back to the office? Now, lots of companies have already decided to let employees work from home even after all this is over. What happens in our industry is unclear. I suspect that pharma companies won't be the drop boxes, and they won't have 100% of everybody working from home. But I think this is actually something that could benefit companies, because if companies feel more and more comfortable with people working from home, it now enables companies to hire people from a variety of geographies without limiting themselves to candidates in their own geography. So Pfizer in New York may hire the best candidate for a particular position. That candidate may be living in a home in a log cabin in the woods in Colorado, for example. And that's great for Pfizer, and that's great for that person sitting at home in Colorado. Now, that person sitting home in Colorado is going to have to fly to New York every once in a while to have meetings. Fair enough. So even with fairly liberal work from home policies moving forward, we still need to get on airplanes. We still need to have face-to-face meetings. People don't think that there are some people out there who don't think that conferences are valuable. I think a lot of people watching this will disagree. There are venues that are being secured for conferences in the second half of next year. We're already seeing that. So what will the normal look like? I think it'll be some blend of what used to be normal versus what we're seeing today. There'll be a lot more work from home, although it won't be 100%. We will be traveling again at some point, but there will probably be measures like masks. We may even be required to carry vaccine passports. We'll have to see how that goes. We will probably be standing in socially distanced lines at conferences and so forth. I suspect the booths that we're used to, those will probably be gone in lieu of, they'll be replaced by wide open spaces, I believe. So there'll be a new normal. It'll be very functional because business must go on. But I think we will see changes second half of next year, and it'll look different compared to what we're used to. So what else is going to happen in 2021 besides the COVID influence changes that we just talked about? Well, I have no idea. I did pick 3 or 4 or 5 things that I'm thinking about, and I do think that next year will be a tale of two halves, first half versus second half. Office and work, we've already talked about, large gatherings, we talked about. One of the things that I'm looking for as a signal is the return of fans back into stadiums to watch football matches and back into arenas to watch basketball, for example. In England, for example, for a short time, some stadia were allowing 2,000 fans to watch football matches live. That's been cut back, but we may start seeing, for example, I don't know, 5,000 fans or 10,000 fans at a baseball game in the summer. Those types of signals are a good thing to keep an eye on, especially as we plan for the second half of next year. So keep these things in mind as you're budgeting for the second half of next year, because travel and so forth may return. In terms of the next four things, these are all related to each other. In terms of deals, I think once everybody started getting used to working from home, the pace picked back up after a delay over the summer. So I think when the numbers come in for 2020, from a deal point of view, licenses, M&A, and so forth, I think the industry will deliver a pretty good number, all things considered. We'll probably see some acceleration in the second half of next year. Now, keep in mind that a lot of the deals that are being signed now, or have been signed this year, were based on relationships that were formed actually in 2019, keeping in mind that we actually went into quote unquote lockdown in, let's say, March, April timeframe. So, to see what the impact of the pandemic has been on deals, we probably won't see that really until we start seeing numbers from fourth quarter of this year and then going into the first half of next year. But I think deal pace should be very, very good. Maybe slightly lower than historical, but certainly very good. Now, clinical trial recruitment has been a problem for many companies. Certainly has been a problem for one of our clients. They're in phase 3 and they've had some difficulty recruiting. For first half of next year, it'll probably be about the same, with some acceleration in the second half. Now, clinical trial recruitment is important from a deal making perspective, obviously, because there are a lot of companies that raise capital based on fresh clinical data. So if clinical trial recruitment is slow, then some of the deal making going into next year will also slow down a little bit. So, clearing up the clinical trial logjam will help accelerate some of the transactions that will happen, especially in the second half of next year. In terms of from a macro point of view, the outlook for Western economies like the U.S., they look grim. There's just no other way around it. We'll show you some data in a moment. Second half maybe slightly less grim, but it just doesn't look very good. Unemployment is very high. It doesn't look like it's going to recover quickly. A lot of jobs that have been lost are not coming back, and that has impact on our industry because now you have higher unemployment, fewer people seeking medical care, fewer people with healthcare insurance, and so forth. So it's something that is directly relevant to our industry. Asia, especially China, South Korea, Japan, they've been doing very well. They've handled the pandemic extremely well for a variety of reasons, including, for example, previous exposure to SARS, lower rates of obesity, and so forth. So they've done very well. They will continue to do well. And again, if you look at these four variables in total, we already see, for example, lots of Chinese companies are becoming much more aggressive from an in-licensing point of view. It wouldn't surprise me if we start seeing more clinical trials conducted in China. We may even see, companies conducting 100% of their clinical trials and approvals in China before, getting those types of products approved, let's say in the U.S. and Europe. And that's just purely based on economics because these economies, the Asian economies, are recovering much better than Western economies. So, going into the first half of next year, I think it's going to be difficult. Things are going to improve as the vaccines roll out and as the virus declines, just due to seasonality. But it will not be back to normal, at least till the second half of next year, in our view. What else can we look forward to next year? Well, This is brought to you by the letter B. And if you're old enough to get the joke, well, let me know. Um, I think there are three other things to keep in mind. I mentioned the economy. This is a U.S. GDP forecast from Deloitte, and here's 2019, here's 2020. You see the drop, which obviously is due to the pandemic. Really, the question is, how fast is this recovery? And from a macro perspective, most of these forecasts are looking at recovery to begin sometime in 2022. However, if you look at it for different industries, there's some industries that'll recover relatively quickly, so they'll look more like this. And other industries, may take 5 years or more to recover. So travel and tourism may take a very long time to recover, for example. So we'll have to see how it goes. But clearly, it's probably gonna take several years for, at least from a GDP point of view, for economies to recover, especially Western economies. The second B is Biden. We have a new president coming in, so now we're going from 8 years of Obama and Obamacare to 4 years of Trump. Now we're swinging back, towards more of a Democrat type of administration. What that's going to mean for our industry, I think it's going to be very, very interesting. I suspect once this, once coronavirus, becomes less of an issue, we may start seeing attacks on pricing and reference pricing and all these other things come back into the discussion. So, I'm not sure if a Biden presidency will be, pro pharma or anti pharma or somewhere in the middle. Right now, it's obviously very pro, since we're part of the solution to the problem. But I suspect that pricing will become an issue again, maybe second half of next year as coronavirus comes under control. We'll have to see. And the third B is Brexit. Now, as of this morning, both the UK and the EU announced that they've come to a trade agreement. It still has to be ratified by the various parliamentary bodies, but it looks like Brexit is fully and finally here, at least as of a few weeks from now. What that means for our industry is again, it's just hard to predict. It's our understanding that some of the grant programs that UK companies were eligible for will still be in place to some degree, like Horizon 2020, which is important for small biotechs in the UK. The UK used to be a very good stepping stone into Europe for a lot of companies. There are several Japanese companies who have their European headquarters in the UK, for example. That's obviously all going to change. It's going to devolve to some degree. What that means for the industry as a whole, again, it's really hard to predict. But clearly, change is coming, change is here, and we'll have to see what happens. So that's basically it. I think, in conclusion, this has been a difficult year for all of us. It's been trying, but I think that 2021 has reasons for being optimistic. I think 2021 is a great opportunity to rethink our business models, rethink our budgets, and if things go well in the second half of 2021, I think 2022 and moving forward is going to be fantastic. So, I try to end the year on a very optimistic note. So thank you for watching. Have a great, safe, and happy new year, and we'll see you in January. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.